The accusation arrived the same way most storms do, without warning and with the quiet cruelty of something that had been gathering strength long before it ever touched my door, carried not by wind or thunder, but by an official envelope bearing the city seal, slipped neatly into my mailbox among grocery, flyers, and utility bills, its weight far heavier than the paper it was printed on. At that point, my life had settled into a rhythm that felt both predictable and earned, built slowly over years of disciplined risk and stubborn patience, the kind of routine that only forms when struggle slowly gives way to stability. My workshop sat behind my home at the edge of the neighborhood, a converted garage that once held nothing more ambitious than dusty holiday decorations and a rusted lawnmower, now transformed into a clean, efficient studio where I restored antique furniture and rare wood pieces for clients who cared about craftsmanship more than convenience. It was not loud, not flashy, and not disruptive, just the steady scent of polished wood and the faint hum of tools working at respectful hours. The HOA, however, had never liked my independence. From the moment I moved in, the board president had taken special interest in the way I lived, the hours I kept, and the quiet flow of delivery trucks that arrived twice a week. She had the posture of moral authority and the appetite of someone who fed on conflict, a presence that hovered over the neighborhood like a surveillance drone dressed in floral blouses and weaponized smiles. Complaints began small, almost trivial, notes about bins being visible for too long, about the shade of stain on my back fence, about the number of visitors who came to my home, even though they parked legally and stayed briefly. Each complaint was filed with the same mechanical precision, and each was dismissed just as quietly, but the pattern never stopped. What she did not understand, and likely never tried to, was that my work was not a hobby masquerading as business but a proper operation, registered, licensed, insured, compliant with every ordinance she could not be bothered to learn. When the official paper unsealed itself into my hands, it claimed I was operating an illegal business in a residential zone, that complaints had been filed detailing excessive noise, unapproved traffic, suspicious renovations, and potential zoning violations, and that I was required to appeal before a review panel or face immediate shutdown and fines. There was something surgical in the way the language had been assembled, cold and precise, a document built to crush without emotion. It did not mention her name, but it did not have to. Fingerprints were unmistakable. What she had done was escalate, not through petty fines or scolding emails, but by reaching directly for the machinery of government, confident it would grind me into compliance like it had so many others. The timing could not have been worse, at least on the surface. Months of preparation had gone into my next phase of expansion, a private opening of a redesigned studio space that would double as a community workshop for heritage restoration, complete with environmentally approved finishes, historical preservation credentials, and media coverage from regional design outlets. The event was meant to mark a turning point, not just for the business, but for the reputation I had quietly built beyond the fence lines of the HOA. I had not advertised it locally, not out of secrecy, but out of practicality, assuming the neighborhood would notice eventually. What they did not notice was the caliber of clients tied to my work, the reason certain names never appeared on social media, and the way my client list read like a private directory for people who valued discretion above all else. Among those clients was someone I had met years earlier through a restoration project tied to a historic waterfront property, a man whose public face was carefully filtered through press conferences and official seals, but whose private life required the same careful handling of legacy wood and aging structures that I specialized in. That relationship had grown not from contracts alone, but from mutual respect, long evenings of patient work, and quieter conversations that never needed transcription. When the letter arrived, I did not panic. Panic is what people do when they have not read the rules. Instead, I sat at the same workbench where I had rebuilt broken heirlooms and studied its fine print with an unsettling calm. I already knew the ordinance numbers they referenced. I already knew I was compliant. And I also knew something she could not possibly have imagined, that the machinery she had activated was now moving toward an event that would place her accusation under the brightest public light she had ever encountered. Over the following days, the neighborhood changed its temperature, glances sharpened, curtains lingered mid-shift, The HOA president circulated like a satisfied rumor made flesh, her posture lifted by the confidence of authority she believed had finally cornered me. The inspection notices followed soon after, confirming visits from zoning officers and safety officials. Each appointment scheduled with bureaucratic indifference, yet heavy with the implied threat of enforcement. Trucks I had ordered months earlier began to arrive with custom equipment for the opening, their presence acting like gasoline on the narrative that had already begun circulating among residents. Stories mutated as they passed from yard to yard, transforming a licensed workshop into a supposed underground operation, turning carefully documented deliveries into clandestine shipments, and converting my quiet focus into the suspicious behavior of someone who clearly must be hiding something. Social order in HOA communities thrives on these distortions, feeding on the gaps between what is seen and what is understood. The first inspection came and went without consequence, the official walking through with a checklist and an expression of mild surprise at how meticulously everything already met code. The second noted minor procedural clarifications that were corrected within hours. The third lasted longer, less because of failure and more because of familiarity, as the inspector seemed to recognize elements of the design from previous projects at landmark sites. Quiet phone calls followed, unheard but not unimportant. Each visit stripped another layer of credibility from the accusation, though none of that reached the HOA channels yet. The president pressed forward regardless, submitting additional claims, attempting to overwhelm bureaucratic patience with volume, convinced that persistence alone could manufacture guilt. Meanwhile, the opening date approached like a tide. Invitations had gone out in carefully selected waves, not to the neighborhood but to investors, preservation experts, journalists, and private clients whose presence would mean more than any press release ever could. Every detail of the event had been refined not only for presentation but for narrative impact. The unveiling of rare restoration techniques, the announcement of partnerships, the subtle unveiling of a community grant program connected to the workshop. From the outside, however, the only part that seemed to register was the continued presence of activity behind my home, which to a mind already convinced of wrongdoing could only confirm its own fears. The HOA president made her final move 3 days before the opening, filing for an emergency cease and desist order on the grounds of imminent community disruption, a tactic designed to create panic and force settlement before scrutiny could catch up. The notice arrived electronically that evening, accompanied by a cascade of automated warnings and the implied spectacle of forced closure. She likely imagined me scrambling, canceling, explaining, trying to repair the narrative she had set on fire. Instead, the preparations continued, the equipment was tested again, the display pieces were arranged with obsessive care, the lighting angles were adjusted to highlight not only the finished surfaces, but the flaws they had once lived with. Every detail carried intention. Beyond the neighborhood's limited field of view, confirmations began to stack. A conservation board chair confirmed attendance. A museum director sent an RSVP crafted with polite enthusiasm. A private note arrived late one night confirming that the client whose schedule was almost never predictable would, in fact, be present if the timeline remained intact. That confirmation did not mention a title. It did not need to. By then, the neighborhood narrative had hardened into something approaching glee. The HOA president distributed a carefully framed bulletin warning residents of ongoing investigations. Language vague enough to imply danger without providing facts that could be challenged. The effect was immediate. A few neighbors kept their distance, others watched openly, some who had benefited quietly from small favors over the years, parking help, restoration advice, anonymous discounts on furniture passed down through their families, looked torn but silent. Fear is an efficient silencer in environments that reward conformity. On the eve of the opening, as the last display piece was positioned and the final inspection report was digitally archived with full clearance, the neighborhood remained suspended in its assumption of impending justice. They expected uniforms, citations, padlocks on doors, and vindication carried on official letterhead. What they did not anticipate was how public the next day would become, how many unfamiliar vehicles would line the street, how many cameras would be raised not in accusation but in admiration. As night settled in, the workshop stood illuminated from within like a stage awaiting its audience, every tool in place, every surface prepared to tell its story under light rather than shadow. Beyond the fence, the HOA president likely rested with the satisfaction of someone who believed the trap was already sprung. She had no way of knowing that the most powerful witness to her failure was already scheduled to walk through my door under his own name and office the following morning. And as the neighborhood drifted into sleep under the comfort of its shared certainty, the machinery she had activated continued to move in a direction she had never considered, quietly aligning the very authority she had tried to weaponize against me into the center of a stage she would soon be forced to share. Morning arrived with an unsettling calm, the kind that makes even familiar spaces feel staged, and as the first light slid across the polished surfaces of the workshop, everything looked less like a place of labor and more like a quiet gallery waiting for its audience, each restored piece positioned to tell a story before anyone ever touched it, while outside the neighborhood stirred under a tension that had thickened overnight into something almost ceremonial, as if the entire street understood that whatever had been whispered for weeks was finally approaching its moment of truth. The first guest vehicles arrived earlier than expected, sleek silhouettes gliding along curbs that had grown accustomed to minivans and delivery trucks, their presence instantly triggering movement behind curtains and on porches, the invisible perimeter of the HOA watchful eye snapping instantly to full attention. Within minutes, phones were raised not for photos but for documentation, neighbors quietly recording what they believed would be evidence of an operation about to be shut down. The HOA president positioned herself like a sentinel near the corner of the street, not obstructing, not greeting, just existing in a posture that signaled ownership of the moment, her confidence so rigid it almost appeared rehearsed, as though she were already imagining the satisfaction of watching officials step in to validate her accusations. Inside the workshop, however, the atmosphere unfolded with a very different gravity, guests entering not with skepticism but curiosity and professional interest, taking in the craftsmanship, running fingers just above surfaces that reflected decades of history rescued from neglect, the scent of treated wood and fresh finish blending with quiet conversations that felt more like assessments than casual praise. Journalists moved subtly, eyes scanning not just the pieces but the people, marking names and faces that would later anchor headlines to credibility. Conservation experts lingered at workstations, recognizing techniques that only circulated within very narrow professional circles, methods that could not be faked or improvised, and their nods of approval were silent confirmations that what stood here could not be reduced to the accusation of impropriety that now loomed in the background of the entire event. The cease and desist notice remained unresolved in a purely technical sense, but its practical force had already weakened, suspended by procedural review and the quiet accumulation of compliance documentation that had been filed so precisely it left little room for interpretation. Outside, however, that nuance meant nothing to the theater of outrage the HOA president had carefully constructed. She waited, eyes scanning for official vehicles rather than the arriving guests, convinced the real arrival would not be the ones stepping through the workshop doors, but the ones meant to close them. As the hour of the formal unveiling approached, traffic increased, the street filling with unfamiliar faces, tailored clothing, press passes, and unmarked security figures whose presence created an undercurrent of authority that had not been part of the HOA imagined script. It was then that the neighborhood's instinctual certainty began to fracture, not in open doubt but in hesitation, as what they were witnessing no longer fit the narrative of a hidden operation exposed by vigilance, but rather something openly recognized, even curated. The HOA president remained outwardly composed, but her posture shifted from triumph to scrutiny, her attention now fixed on the caliber of the arriving guests rather than their mere presence. When the private convoy finally appeared at the far end of the street, it arrived without spectacle yet with an unmistakable signature of control, the kind of arrival that does not announce itself loudly because it does not need to, flanked discreetly by individuals whose awareness of their surroundings was constant and exact. The vehicle stopped with deliberate smoothness, and when the door opened, the quiet recalibration of the entire space was immediate, as though the atmosphere itself recognized a shift in hierarchy before anyone consciously registered a face. The man who stepped out carried neither entourage nor theatrical flourish, just the unassuming weight of public authority worn so often it had become invisible to him. And within seconds, a ripple of recognition spread through those who were professionally trained to recognize such figures. He entered the workshop not as a guest seeking entertainment, but as a client returning to a familiar collaboration, moving with ease between displayed pieces that bore the signature of projects tied to locations most only ever saw in photographs. Inside, the unveiling proceeded exactly as planned, a progression that subtly revealed not just new capabilities, but long-standing relationships encoded into the work itself, each piece tied to a story of preservation and trust that had been accumulated far from the HOA line of sight. Outside, the neighborhood's confusion sharpened as unfamiliar security patterns became impossible to ignore, and the HOA president, sensing that the moment was slipping from her control, initiated her long, prepared maneuver by contacting enforcement directly, reinforcing the urgency of her claims. With the insistence of someone who believed she still held the upper hand, the response arrived faster than she expected, but not in the shape she had anticipated, as city officials did appear. Yet their manner carried none of the aggressive authority she had been counting on. Instead of immediate intervention, there was consultation, cross-referencing, and visible deference to the figures already present inside the workshop. Within minutes, whispered exchanges began traveling along the sidewalk, half-formed realizations spreading through small clusters of neighbors as names were quietly matched to faces. The accusation that had once sounded so decisive now felt suddenly fragile, exposed to the kind of scrutiny that does not tolerate narrative shortcuts. Inside, the man whose presence would soon redefine the entire situation moved through the space with visible familiarity, stopping at one particular piece that had once been part of a publicly known restoration effort tied to a waterfront landmark, his recognition of it immediate and unguarded, sparking attention from those who had not previously understood the breadth of the relationships embedded in the room. Formal portion of the event transitioned smoothly into private discussions as media representatives discreetly repositioned, sensing that the true story was evolving beyond the planned press narrative into something far more volatile and compelling. Outside, the HOA president stood increasingly isolated, her phone pressed to her ear as layered realities collided with the scripted outcome she had anticipated. Each new official arrival diluted the authority she imagined she commanded, and the realization that the machinery she had attempted to weaponize was now aligning independently of her influence began to take form in her tightening expression. The cease and desist, once her most potent instrument, now appeared merely procedural, a document drifting helplessly through channels that had suddenly acquired a far higher priority. The presence of high-ranking city officials transformed the enforcement posture entirely, turning what she intended to be a public shutdown into a quiet audit of her claims themselves. Neighbors who had once nodded along with her warnings now watched with uncertainty, unsure whether association with the accusation would soon carry consequences of its own. The workshop's interior, meanwhile, had become a convergence point for discussions that blurred the line between private enterprise and civic partnership, with proposals surfacing for expanded community programs, heritage grants, and collaborative projects that implied a future far larger than what anyone outside the fence had imagined. Each conversation layered legitimacy atop legitimacy, compressing the space in which the accusation could still survive. The mayor's quiet presence, now no longer deniable, anchored the entire unfolding spectacle with an authority that required no announcement, and the knowledge of who he was spread not through formal declaration, but through the subtle, electric awareness that moves faster than any official statement. Outside, the HOA president's confidence finally fractured into visible unease as she grasped that the confrontation she had been engineering was no longer hers to control. The officials she had summoned did not act against the workshop, but instead requested documentation from both sides, and the imbalance that followed was one she had not prepared for, as my records unfolded in calm, methodical order, while her allegations collapsed inward into a tangle of unverified claims and selectively framed complaints. The spectatorship of the neighborhood shifted from expectation to apprehension, as those who had once assumed guilt now sensed the gravitational pull of a much larger truth forming in real time. The opening event continued uninterrupted, a steady procession of recognition, networking, and quiet validation unfolding just beyond the fence line, while outside the energy twisted into something volatile and unsure. Somewhere between these two worlds, the storm she had tried to summon was already turning back on its source. Although none of this had yet erupted into the kind of public reckoning that would finally expose the full cost of her campaign. As the afternoon wore on and the weight of authority settled unmistakably within the workshop, one truth became unavoidable even to those who resisted it. This was never the stage for a takedown, it was the stage for a miscalculation of extraordinary scale, and the consequences were only beginning to gather momentum beneath the surface of polite conversation and controlled smiles, setting the conditions for a second shift far more devastating than the first. By late afternoon, the street no longer felt like a neighborhood, but like the outer ring of an unfolding civic event, its quiet order reshaped by unfamiliar authority, media presence, and a growing awareness that something irreversible was taking place just beyond the line of hedges and fences that once defined private space. The workshop had transformed from a planned unveiling into a gravitational center where influence, legitimacy, and quiet power intersected, every movement inside echoing outward into the deterioration of the narrative the HOA president had spent months constructing. Word moved faster than official statements ever could, flowing through text messages, private social media threads, and whispered exchanges between neighbors who now found themselves trapped between what they had believed and what they were witnessing. The mayor's presence, no longer deniable, became the pivot point of every conversation, his familiarity with the space, the work, and the long-term plans erasing in a single sweep the implication of secrecy or illegitimacy that had fueled the accusations. The city officials previously summoned as instruments of enforcement were now repositioned as auditors, their questions turning not toward the workshop, but toward the origin of the complaints themselves, their attention shifting with the unmistakable logic of institutional gravity. The HOA president, once so certain of the trajectory she had set in motion, found herself pacing at the edge of this rearranged reality, her voice rising and falling in patterns of protest that no longer commanded interest but scrutiny. Each claim she repeated now triggered requests for substantiation rather than immediate reaction, and in the slowing rhythm of that exchange, her authority began to dissolve under the weight of her own overreach. The inspection reports favoring the workshop circulated quietly among officials, but their effect was immediate and unmistakable, transforming the accusation from a threat into a procedural inconvenience that had already lost momentum. Inside, conversations advanced into territory far removed from neighborhood squabbles, touching on funding frameworks, municipal collaborations, and long-term investment into heritage preservation initiatives that extended the workshop's reach far beyond the residential perimeter that had once seemed so defining. Every glance exchanged between professionals carried layers of context the HOA narrative could never account for, histories of collaboration that predated the subdivision itself and rendered its internal politics irrelevant to the wider cityscape of development and conservation. Outside, the neighbors watched the shifting posture of authority with unease, some realizing too late that they had accepted the HOA president's version of events without evidence, others instinctively recalibrating their allegiances as it became clear that proximity to her no longer offered social safety, but potential liability. The media presence, initially drawn by the novelty of a supposed zoning showdown, began to reframe its lens, redirecting attention toward the spectacle of a private citizen wrongly accused at the precise moment their work entered a new public phase of civic recognition. Cameras repositioned, not in search of tears or conflict, but in anticipation of a story of procedural collapse and institutional recalibration. A far more compelling narrative than the petty enforcement drama originally anticipated. The HOA president attempted to reclaim the narrative through repetition, through louder insistence, through the strategic invocation of disorder and community harm. But the more forcefully she pressed, the less influence her words seemed to carry, dissolving against the composed counterweight of documentation, certification, and visible endorsement by figures whose authority operated on a scale she could not reach through accusation alone. Her emergency cease and desist, once framed as an instrument of imminent control, now hung in administrative suspension, its legal force eroded by compliance that had already rendered it procedurally obsolete. In quiet side exchanges between officials, the origin timeline of her filings began to matter more than their content. Patterns of escalation and persistence, raising questions not of safety, but of motive. The workshop event itself reached its formal apex with the unveiling of partnerships that signaled a future no longer confined to residential boundaries, and the symbolic weight of that moment landed with full clarity on those who understood what it meant for institutional trust to be publicly extended in such a visible way. Applause inside the workshop carried outward in softened echoes, reaching the sidewalk where it was received not as celebration, but as confirmation of a reversal no one had prepared to interpret. The neighbors who once treated the workshop as a suspicious anomaly now encountered it reframed as a sanctioned cornerstone of broader community development, and with that reframing came an uncomfortable realization of how easily perception could be engineered through unchallenged repetition. The mayor's conversations remained understated, but each exchange he engaged in carried seismic implications for those who recognized the signals of long-term alignment embedded within his words, references to future grants, to cross-departmental support, to civic visibility that could not coexist with unresolved allegations of illegality. Outside, the HOA president's agitation sharpened into something brittle as she watched the official she had called begin to ask questions that pointed not outward but inward, toward HOA records, toward complaint histories, toward the procedural conduct of the board itself. She had envisioned a spectacle of enforcement, and instead found herself at the edge of an inquiry that was quietly rearranging the balance of exposure. Neighbors who had once relied on her confidence as proof of correctness now avoided her gaze, sensing that alignment with her at this moment could tether them to consequences still forming beneath the surface. The street itself seemed to exhale as the initial expectation of shutdown dissipated, replaced by a longer, more ambiguous tension that carried all the weight of a reversal still unfolding. Inside, as the event moved into quieter, more private discussions, the media's role shifted from observer to archivist of a narrative now far larger than the HOA frame, capturing not only the visible endorsements but the contextual gravity that made those endorsements meaningful. The presence of city leadership within a space accused of illegality created a visual contradiction too stark to ignore, a contradiction that demanded explanation in print and broadcast alike. Each camera angle became a statement of alignment, and with every published frame, the accusation lost another layer of plausibility. The HOA president's isolation grew more pronounced by the hour, her physical proximity to the spectacle no longer granting her influence, but instead emphasizing her exclusion from the core of the unfolding significance. She remained physically present yet narratively irrelevant, her earlier authority now reduced to a background tension whose origins were increasingly viewed as suspect rather than justified. The officials she had summoned began scheduling follow-up audits not of the workshop but of HOA procedures, communications, and enforcement histories, a shift she could sense but not stop as it unfolded through layers of protocol she no longer controlled. The neighbors, who had once waited for validation of her warnings, now waited for something else entirely, an explanation of how they had been pulled so confidently toward a conclusion that was unraveling in front of them. As dusk approached, the workshop's interior lighting softened into evening warmth, and the final guests began to depart with the quiet assurance of people who had witnessed not a confrontation but a realignment, one that would ripple outward through professional and civic channels long after the street returned to its ordinary traffic. The mayor's departure carried no ceremony, yet left behind an unmistakable vacuum of authority in which the HOA president's claims could no longer breathe. The officials left in stages, their work far from finished, but their posture unmistakably altered, no longer enforcers but investigators tracing the path of a complaint that had overreached its mandate. The street, emptied gradually of the unfamiliar vehicles that had transformed it for the day, returned to its quiet state, but not to its former certainty. Something fundamental had shifted in the architecture of belief that governed the neighborhood, and while no formal reckoning had yet occurred, the conditions for one were now fully in place. The HOA president retreated at last from her vigil with an expression that betrayed neither apology nor clarity, but a taut calculation of next moves, as if still searching for leverage within a landscape that had quietly stripped it from her hands. The neighbors drifted back into their homes with unanswered questions pressing against assumptions they had held too comfortably. And in that unsettled quiet, the story of the accusation was no longer the story of a violation, but the opening chapter of an exposure whose full shape had yet to emerge. The days following the opening settled into a strange dual reality, one where the neighborhood attempted to return to its routines while an invisible process moved steadily beneath the surface, gathering evidence, aligning timelines, and pulling at threads that the HOA president had never imagined would unravel so far beyond her initial target. On the outside, lawns were trimmed, trash bins rolled out on schedule, and the polite choreography of suburban life resumed with forced normality. Yet beneath every exchanged glance lingered the awareness that the accusation which had once defined the block had now become the subject of scrutiny itself. The workshop reopened under ordinary operating hours, its legitimacy no longer contested in whispers but reinforced through visible continuity, deliveries arriving without interruption, clients visiting without hesitation, and the flow of work proceeding with a calm that stood in sharp contrast to the undercurrent of inquiry now aimed at the HOA board. Official requests for documentation began arriving at the HOA office within 48 hours of the event, each one framed with procedural neutrality yet carrying unmistakable implication, asking for records of complaints, enforcement actions, internal communications, and the justification process that had led to the emergency cease and desist filing. The HOA president responded as she always had, with confidence layered over control, asserting the board's diligence and community, first motives. Yet for the first time, her assertions encountered a kind of silence that did not signal agreement, but verification. Across the neighborhood, rumors mutated once again, shifting from speculation about an illegal business to speculation about how deeply the board itself might be exposed. And with every iteration, the certainty that had once belonged to accusation now attached itself to the possibility of institutional overreach. The neighbors who had quietly assisted in supplying anecdotal complaints began to feel that assistance retroactively illuminated under a far harsher light, each memory of an off-hand remark or exaggerated irritation now carrying the weight of potential evidence in a process they could no longer influence. Within the workshop, the post-opening momentum unfolded with remarkable speed as inquiries flowed in from regional partners eager to formalize collaborations announced only days earlier. Contracts written with language that extended not just months but years into the future, embedding the business deeper into networks of accountability and public trust that stood far beyond the HOA reach. The quiet irony of this acceleration was not lost on those who observed it closely, the very attempt to halt the operation having instead propelled it into a tier of legitimacy that made future interference exponentially more difficult. Meanwhile, the internal dynamics of the HOA board began to shift as requests for transparency exposed fractures that had long been masked by unity of tone, if not unity of conscience. Board members who had once deferred to the president's decisiveness now found themselves individually accountable for votes they had cast under the comfort of presumed authority, their names appearing on documents scrutinized by city offices whose tolerance for informal governance was narrower than they had ever been led to believe. The president attempted to consolidate control through emergency meetings and procedural framing, insisting that the board present a unified posture, Yet the questions now being asked by external auditors were not ones that could be smoothed over by consensus language alone. They demanded specific chains of authorization, original sources of complaints, timestamps of escalation, and proof that due diligence had been exercised before invoking emergency powers. Each missing piece amplified the gravity of what had once seemed a routine administrative maneuver. In the neighborhood, the social temperature cooled in an unfamiliar way as doors once open for casual validation now remained closed. Conversations shortened, alliances recalculated, and the quiet fear of being counted among those whose voices had been amplified without scrutiny settled into the collective mood. The HOA president, sensing the shift in perception even as she resisted acknowledging it, intensified her narrative among her remaining allies, framing the unfolding audit as retaliation rather than review, casting herself as the defender of community order under unjust attack. Yet even within those diminishing circles, the rhetoric began to ring hollow as more details surfaced not through rumor, but through visible procedural correspondence and official presence. The workshop, once portrayed as the disruptive element, now existed as the fixed point of stability around which institutional processes recalibrated, its compliance transforming from a defensive shield into a quiet baseline against which deviations elsewhere were measured. City officials returned not as enforcers but as auditors, their visits now directed not toward my property but toward the HOA office itself, an inversion that unfolded with quiet inevitability rather than dramatic confrontation. Their inquiries progressed with methodical patience, neither rushed nor sensationalized, leaving no room for grandstanding or emotional defense, only documentation and timelines. The presidency's once rigid confidence began to show hairline fractures as incomplete records surfaced, communications that revealed editorialized language substituted for factual reporting, and patterns of escalation that suggested fixation rather than neutral assessment. Each discovery narrowed the space in which the original accusation could be framed as good faith governance. The news cycle, which had initially flirted with the spectacle of a zoning controversy, now pivoted toward the far more compelling narrative of procedural abuse within a residential authority. The transformation subtle yet decisive as headlines shifted their emphasis from the alleged violator to the process that had manufactured the allegation. In the background of these developments, private conversations unfolded among board members who began to recognize the gravity of their collective exposure, each aware that the insulation they once believed their shared silence provided was rapidly thinning under the heat of institutional inquiry. Some attempted to distance themselves quietly, revisiting meeting minutes with new urgency, scanning email threads with a kind of retrospective dread, while others doubled down on loyalty in the hope that unity might yet blunt accountability. The HOA president remained publicly defiant, her posture unaltered in appearance if not in substance, but the cadence of her statements grew sharper, less assured, more reactive than commanding. In the neighborhood, the shift manifested in small but telling ways as lawn conversations fell silent when she appeared, as invitations ceased to circulate through the same channels, as the gravitational center of social validation began to drift away from her orbit and toward quieter, less conspicuous figures. The building tension expressed itself not in confrontation but in absence, the slow withdrawal of trust acting as a more potent rebuke than open challenge ever could. Inside the workshop, the work continued with deliberate steadiness, each restored piece moving out into client hands as further confirmation that the operation not only endured but expanded under the very scrutiny meant to extinguish it. The mayor's office issued no public statement beyond routine acknowledgments of partnership discussions, yet the absence of correction itself served as implicit endorsement, allowing the reconfigured narrative to solidify without overt amplification. As the audit progressed, the scope of inquiry widened incrementally, moving from the singular episode of the cease and desist toward a broader pattern of selective enforcement, uncovering prior cases where similar tactics had been deployed with less visible resistance and fewer resources for rebuttal. The implications of this expansion reached deep into the bones of the HOA operational history, transforming what the president had framed as an isolated act of vigilance into a test case for the entire governance structure she had presided over. Neighbors who had once taken fines and warnings as an unavoidable cost of communal order now revisited those experiences under a new and far more unsettling light, questioning whether their own compliance had been shaped by fairness or by unchallenged authority. The cumulative effect of these realizations did not erupt in anger, but settled into a quiet recalibration of consciousness that reshaped the social contract of the neighborhood from within. By the end of the week, the HOA office itself carried an unfamiliar atmosphere of restraint, its once confident flow of notices and warnings replaced by a hesitant silence, punctuated only by official correspondence from outside agencies now charting its internal terrain. The president's voice, once amplified through bulletins and directives, echoed less frequently through community channels, and when it did, it met a reception of cautious neutrality rather than reflexive alignment. The storm she had summoned against one household had redirected itself into a process far larger and far less personal, one that did not operate on spectacle but on accumulation, its momentum derived not from outrage but from record and pattern. And as the neighborhood settled into this uneasy weight, the awareness grew that the true confrontation was no longer about a workshop or zoning lines, but about the architecture of power that had quietly governed their lives, now exposed to a level of scrutiny it had never faced before. The formal notice arrived at the HOA office on a Wednesday morning, delivered with the quiet finality of procedural language that does not argue but informs, its contents not yet public, yet already reshaping the internal gravity of the entire board as it confirmed that the city's review had now escalated into a full compliance investigation with the authority to audit financial records, enforcement histories, and communication logs going back several years. What had once been framed as routine, governance had now crossed into regulated oversight, and with that shift came a weight that no amount of local bluster could displace. Within hours, the atmosphere inside the HOA leadership fractured into two visible postures: those who still clung to the president's narrative of unjust attack, and those who had begun quietly positioning themselves for survival. Emails grew shorter, responses grew slower. The effortless unity that had once made decisions feel automatic now required negotiation, clarification, and in some cases legal consultation. Outside that office, the neighborhood absorbed the news in waves, first through rumor, then through confirmation, and finally through the dawning comprehension that the authority structure they had lived under was no longer insulated from consequence. Lawns were still cut and driveways still swept, but the cadence of normal life carried a new undertone, as if the ground itself had taken on a subtle instability beneath familiar routines. The workshop, meanwhile, continued its expansion with relentless normalcy, contracts moving forward, suppliers adjusting capacity, and new project proposals arriving with a regularity that no longer felt lucky but earned, the visibility brought by the opening now amplifying every success in a citywide context that rendered the HOA boundary increasingly irrelevant. Where once neighbors had whispered about enforcement, they now whispered about exposure, about subpoenas, about how far back the investigators might go, about which moments from their own history might resurface under scrutiny they had never expected to face. The HOA president maintained her public posture, issuing a bulletin framed around cooperation and confidence, emphasizing that the investigation would clear the board of wrongdoing and reaffirm its commitment to community standards. Yet the language carried an unfamiliar defensiveness that undermined its intended reassurance. The tone no longer projected command but containment, an effort to stabilize perception in the face of forces she could no longer dominate through decisiveness alone. Board meetings grew longer and less productive, their agendas reshaped not around future projects, but around document requests, legal briefings, and increasingly tense discussions about how much responsibility was individual versus collective. Each member now saw their name not as an abstract fixture of governance, but as a potential line item in a report that would soon be read far beyond the boundaries of the subdivision. The odd, its early findings began to ripple outward through quiet confirmations that could not yet be quoted but could be strongly inferred. Patterns of selective enforcement where similar violations had produced wildly different consequences. Communication chains that revealed editorial framing designed to steer outcomes, and most destabilizing of all, the absence of independent verification before emergency actions were taken. The emergency cease and desist against the workshop began to look less like vigilance and more like a culmination of unchecked discretion. The media's interest sharpened accordingly, shifting from retrospective coverage of the opening to forward-looking analysis of the investigation, with reporters now requesting interviews not only with affected homeowners but with former board members who had long since stepped away from organization under less dramatic circumstances. Those voices, once isolated and discounted, now found unexpected relevance as their past experiences mapped uncomfortably well onto the behaviors now under review. Each new account added volume to a growing chorus that recontextualized the president's leadership from assertive to unilateral, from protective to presumptive. Inside the neighborhood, the psychological shift became visible and small, telling deflections as residents who once defended every board decision now hedged their language, speaking in conditional tones where they once spoke with certainty, testing the social air before expressing any opinion that might later be placed under the lens of accountability. The president felt this erosion acutely, even as she refused to acknowledge it, her once natural authority now encountering subtle resistance in the form of procedural questions she was unaccustomed to answering. Requests for justification that would once have been dismissed as insubordination were now framed as due diligence, and the distinction between leadership and dominance began to separate in uncomfortable public view. The city's inquiries reached beyond complaint records into budgetary allocations, revealing how enforcement fines had been absorbed, redirected, and in some cases reinvested into discretionary projects whose prioritization no longer appeared neutral when examined against the backdrop of selective enforcement. This financial angle introduced a new axis of vulnerability, transforming the investigation from a question of motive into a question of benefit, a far more dangerous territory for any organization operating on community trust. The workshop's success continued to act as a quiet counterpoint to the instability unfolding at the HOA level, its steady output of visible achievement forming a stark contrast to the disruption now defined by records, reviews, and the slow grind of institutional accountability. Neighbors who had avoided eye contact in the early days after the opening now returned tentative nods, some even initiating small, careful gestures of goodwill. Not yet apologies, but acknowledgments of a reality that had shifted too far to deny. The president's allies grew fewer, not because opinions had reversed overnight, but because alignment now carried a visible risk that could no longer be dismissed as hypothetical. Each external confirmation of the investigation's seriousness narrowed the space in which loyalty could be comfortably maintained. Legal counsel became a recurring presence at board meetings, their tone measured and precise, their guidance emphasizing exposure rather than dominance, mitigation rather than reaffirmation of control. It was in that shift that the president's isolation deepened most profoundly, as her instinct to project certainty collided with advisors trained to recognize when certainty itself had become a liability. The investigation's timeline expanded backward in incremental disclosures, with each new request for records implying that the frame of inquiry had widened further than most had anticipated. And with that expansion came the slow realization that this was no longer about a single complaint gone wrong, but about a governance style, now being measured against standards that did not bend for personality. The neighborhood absorbed this transformation with a mix of quiet apprehension and restrained hope, some bracing for the destabilization that often follows institutional reckoning, others sensing that a long, suppressed imbalance might finally be forced into the open. The workshop's role in all of this settled into something almost paradoxical, both the catalyst and the proof that legitimacy did not have to be conferred by local authority alone. Its survival now inseparable from the exposure that threatened to dismantle the structure that had once tried so confidently to suppress it. As the week closed under the weight of gathering documentation and unresolved questions, the HOA office remained lit late into the evening more often than not, its windows illuminating figures bent over files rather than issuing directives, a reversal in posture as symbolic as it was practical. The storm that had been summoned against one home now sat squarely over the institution that had unleashed it, and for the first time, the president faced a reality she could not redirect through accusation or urgency alone, as the machinery of oversight moved forward with the impersonal certainty of process indifferent to narrative, reputation, or the instincts of control that had once governed her world. The first subpoenas were issued quietly, without spectacle, yet their effect rippled through the HOA like a tremor beneath a glass floor, invisible at first glance but felt instantly by everyone standing above it, as board members received formal demands for personal communications, financial disclosures tied to HOA operations, and sworn statements regarding their roles in past enforcement actions, transforming what had once been a shared shield of institutional identity into a series of individual positions now exposed to direct examination. The shift from collective scrutiny to personal accountability altered everything, fracturing the last illusion that the board could absorb the impact as a single entity and emerge intact. The HOA president attempted to respond with the same controlled intensity that had once allowed her to dominate meetings and steer outcomes through force of certainty alone. But this time her directives moved through a maze of legal obligations, each instruction filtered through attorneys whose loyalty was to procedure rather than to her authority. The board members who had once deferred to her instincts now deferred to counsel, a subtle but irrevocable transfer of power that stripped her voice of its former unilateral weight. In private, each member began to reassess their past alignment with a precision sharpened by survival instinct, revisiting votes they had cast, objections they had swallowed, and moments of silence that now loomed larger than any overt act. The investigation's focus sharpened with unsettling efficiency as the earliest document reviews revealed inconsistencies not only in how complaints had been categorized, but in how enforcement priorities had been selectively reinforced. Patterns emerging that pointed not to random oversight, but to strategic escalation driven by subjective judgment rather than neutral policy. The emergency cease and desist against the workshop, now long rendered void by overwhelming compliance evidence, emerged as the clearest crystallization of that pattern, its rushed issuance and thin verification standing out in stark contrast to the far more lenient handling of comparable cases buried quietly in HOA archives. As this context assembled itself within the investigative framework, the personal stakes for the HOA president intensified beyond reputation or leadership into the realm of direct exposure. Each procedural shortcut she had once justified as efficiency now reframed as potential overreach. Within the neighborhood, the social realignment accelerated as residents began receiving requests from investigators seeking statements, clarification of past complaints, and confirmation of how certain narratives had circulated. For many, this marked their first direct contact with the machinery of accountability, and it unsettled them in ways the original enforcement tactics never had, as they were forced to confront not just what they had observed, but what they had repeated, exaggerated, or permitted through passive approval. The careful moral distance that once allowed casual alignment with authority now collapsed, replaced by the uncomfortable realization that participation did not require authorship, only acquiescence. The workshop remained visibly untouched by the turbulence unfolding around it, its operations not only steady but visibly expanding as new hires joined the team, additional suppliers were contracted, and the physical footprint of the space subtly evolved to accommodate a workload that now exceeded pre-opening projections. This quiet growth, occurring in parallel with the disintegration of the HOA certainty, created a contrast that was impossible to ignore. The stability of one born from measured process standing against the instability of another born from unchecked discretion. The mayor's office maintained its studied neutrality in public statements, yet behind closed doors the alignment continued to deepen as planning sessions unfolded for community, integrated initiatives that would tie the workshop's future directly into municipal development pathways, embedding it within frameworks that dwarfed the HOA influence not only in scale but in permanence. The president's attempts to characterize the investigation as an attack lost traction as the scope of the inquiry widened, and its procedural legitimacy became undeniable. Its pace deliberate rather than theatrical, its focus systemic rather than personalized, precisely the kind of scrutiny that cannot be neutralized through narrative control alone. Board meetings transformed into exercises in legal risk management rather than governance, agendas dominated by document preparation, counsel strategy, and tense efforts to anticipate rather than direct outcomes. The emotional climate inside those closed rooms thickened with stress as the reality of individual consequence replaced the abstract comfort of collective authority, voices tightening where once they commanded, hesitations stretching where once they decided. Outside, the residents felt the ripple effects in subtle ways as enforcement activities slowed. Fines were delayed, and long-standing citations were quietly paused under the justification of procedural review, a visible weakening of the board's once relentless operational tempo. This unexpected reprieve allowed a long, muted tension to surface among homeowners who had lived under the constant threat of penalty, their relief tempered by uncertainty over what would replace the familiar structure, even if it proved flawed. The HOA president's presence in the neighborhood shifted from commanding to scrutinized. Her movements once interpreted as vigilance, now registered as restlessness. Her appearances at community spaces met with cautious distance rather than reflexive deference. The psychological authority she had cultivated over years did not shatter in a moment but eroded in layers, each layer stripped away by the simple fact that she was now being watched with the same intensity she had once directed outward. The subpoena process drew attention to financial flows that had rarely been questioned by residents, revealing how fine revenue was tracked, allocated, and justified, and introducing a level of fiscal transparency that proved far more destabilizing than any single allegation could have been. Discrepancies that might once have been dismissed as clerical now appeared consequential when placed within a broader pattern of selective enforcement. And with each clarification request, the weight of administrative accountability deepened. The media's framing evolved again as the narrative shifted from procedural curiosity to structural exposure, with headlines increasingly focused on how small governance bodies could accumulate unchecked power through mechanisms designed for order rather than dominance. The HOA story became less about individual personalities and more about architectural flaws in oversight, a reframing that diminished the president's ability to cast herself as either villain or victim within a simplified moral arc. The neighborhood's internal culture adapted in response as conversations moved away from speculation and toward reflection, neighbors reconsidering how easily certainty had traveled through informal networks and how little verification it had required to harden into collective belief. For some, this reckoning arrived with guilt. For others, with anger at having been so readily mobilized into alignment without access to the full context of what they were endorsing. The workshop, now a fixed point of professional credibility within the city's cultural landscape, became an unspoken reference point for this broader reassessment, its survival and growth serving as daily evidence that legitimacy could be manufactured not through authority but through consistency, documentation, and deliberate integration with systems that demanded proof rather than performance. As the investigation pressed forward, the HOA president found herself increasingly alone in her certainty, each new legal briefing narrowing the scope of what she could safely claim, each procedural step gently but firmly redirecting her from narrative control toward factual accountability. The power she had once exercised through decisiveness now met resistance not through opposition but through documentation. An impersonal force that did not argue, yet steadily displaced her from the center of the story she had once orchestrated. And as summer edged closer and the rhythms of daily life continued to rearrange themselves around this evolving reality, the neighborhood sensed that what lay ahead would not be a dramatic collapse but a slower, more exhaustive dismantling, one file at a time, one statement at a time, as the weight of accumulated record began to redefine not just one leader's fate, but the structure that had enabled her rise. The tipping point arrived without spectacle, not through sirens or sudden arrests, but through the slow, irreversible accumulation of fact as the investigation's preliminary findings were formally communicated to the HOA board in a closed session that stretched late into the night, its contents classified yet its consequences immediately visible in the altered posture of everyone who emerged from that room. By morning, the symbolic architecture of authority that had once defined the neighborhood felt hollowed out, still standing in shape but emptied of its certainty, as word traveled with careful speed that the board's procedural immunity had effectively collapsed. Enforcement actions were formally suspended pending further review, a quiet administrative decision that carried an impact more destabilizing than any dramatic confrontation could have produced, signaling to every resident that the mechanisms once used to discipline were themselves now under discipline. The HOA president attempted to present this suspension as a temporary logistical adjustment, but the language rang thin against the visible reality that her operational control had dissolved into conditional approval at best. The neighborhood absorbed this shift with a bewildering mix of relief and disorientation, as years of patterned behavior suddenly lost their predictive power, leaving residents unsure not only of what rules still applied, but of who truly held the authority to enforce them. The silence of the enforcement office became louder than any warning notice ever had, and into that silence rushed long, suppressed grievances, private conversations reignited in kitchens and backyards as homeowners compared past fines, inconsistent rulings, and moments where discretion had felt less like judgment and more like personal preference. The workshop's presence within this transforming ecosystem assumed a different weight now, no longer merely the catalyst of institutional scrutiny, but a stabilizing reference point in a landscape suddenly stripped of its familiar regulatory gravity. The mayor's office, sensing both the vacuum and the volatility of this transition, moved with deliberate care to avoid direct intervention while quietly reinforcing the legitimacy of independent civic processes that would soon determine the HOA immediate future. In effect, the city positioned itself not as a conqueror of local authority, but as the framework within which that authority would be measured, allowing the consequences to unfold through oversight rather than decree. Inside the HOA office, the internal fracture deepened into explicit conflict as board members absorbed the implications of the findings they had just received, some recognizing that their passive participation now carried a cost that could not be redirected onto collective identity alone. The president's insistence on unified messaging encountered open resistance for the first time, her tone of command clashing with voices now sharpened by personal exposure and legal counsel, each member measuring loyalty against survival with a clarity that stripped rhetoric of its former power. Resignations were discussed in private tones long before any were announced, the word itself hovering in the air as both threat and release, as some members calculated that departure might offer the only remaining path to distance themselves from the momentum of accountability now accelerating beyond their capacity to shape. The investigation's reach continued to widen outward through archived records, revealing how patterns of selective escalation had created a behavioral ecosystem in which minor infractions carried disproportionate consequences depending not on objective standard, but on relational proximity. Authority, the more this picture sharpened, the harder it became to sustain the narrative of isolated overreach, replacing it instead with the outline of a system quietly optimized for control through unpredictability. Residents who had once prided themselves on their compliance began to recognize the emotional taxes of living under such uncertainty. The constant low-grade vigilance that had shaped daily behavior long before the words investigation or audit it ever entered their vocabulary. This realization did not erupt in rage, but in a collective exhale, a release of tension so subtle it was felt more than spoken, as if the neighborhood itself were slowly lowering its shoulders after years of unconscious strain. The HOA president's isolation crystallized into something unmistakable as her presence no longer drew alignment but calculated distance. Conversations pausing when she approached. Invitations rerouted through alternate networks that no longer passed through her gatekeeping influence. The power she once exercised through immediacy now encountered delay at every turn, responses arriving filtered through counsel, requests meeting conditions rather than compliance, and the psychological dominance she had cultivated eroding under the friction of procedural restraint. Meanwhile, The workshop's integration into municipal planning advanced with steady momentum as formal agreements were drafted positioning it as a recurring site for public education, conservation training, and community restoration grants, embedding its operations into pathways that would outlast individual administrations and render local interference structurally irrelevant. This alignment, though absent from dramatic announcement, reshaped the symbolic geography of the neighborhood, shifting the axis of legitimacy from internal authority to external verification grounded in public record. The media's sustained interest now focused not on conflict but on transformation, documenting how a small residential governance body had become the unlikely center of a citywide conversation about oversight, discretion, and the fragile boundary between order and control. Former board members from entirely different districts began to surface in commentary, drawing parallels that reframed the unfolding events as part of a broader structural vulnerability rather than an aberration confined to a single community. This broader context further diluted the HOA president's ability to center herself as either adversary or guardian within a personalized narrative, dissolving her story into a larger discussion that did not need her to advance. The subpoena process yielded its most destabilizing effect not through any single revelation, but through the cumulative confirmation that oversight had been presumed rather than practiced, that authority had been trusted rather than verified, and that the mechanisms designed to distribute responsibility had instead concentrated it into the hands of those least accustomed to explaining their decisions. The board's legal counsel, now navigating a terrain where mitigation had replaced defense, advised reassessment of leadership structure as a risk reduction measure, a suggestion that echoed through the internal hierarchy like a quiet thunderclap. Though no vote was taken immediately, the significance of the council's recommendation was not lost on anyone present, marking the first official acknowledgement that survival of the institution might require sacrifice of the figure who had long defined it. The neighborhood sensed this shift long before any public acknowledgement, as subtle signals filtered outward through behavior rather than announcement. Enforcement still paused, communication subdued, the cadence of authority slowed as if testing whether the old rhythms could even resume. Into this unsettled space stepped a growing number of residents no longer content to wait for outcomes, but eager to shape what would replace the structure now suspended in uncertainty. Informal gatherings forming around the idea of participation rather than obedience, of governance as collective stewardship rather than top-down decree. This cultural pivot, still embryonic yet undeniably present, marked the most profound consequence of the entire conflict. A reorientation not of rules but of relationship between authority and community. The HOA president, watching this transformation from the margins of influence she once commanded absolutely, faced a reality far more destabilizing than public condemnation, the erosion of relevance itself as the center of gravity drifted beyond her reach. The storm she had summoned to discipline a single household had rewritten the temperature of the entire neighborhood, replacing fear with scrutiny, passivity with engagement, and certainty with hard, necessary questions that no directive could silence. As the investigation advanced toward its formal interim conclusions and the mechanisms of resolution began to take perceptible shape, it became clear that the story's final turning point would not arrive through punishment alone, but through the irreversible redefinition of power that had already begun to take root in the spaces she no longer controlled. The formal conclusions arrived without ceremony on a quiet morning that felt deliberately ordinary, as if the machinery of accountability understood that the truest endings rarely arrive with noise, but with documents, signatures, and the language so precise it leaves no room for emotional negotiation, only outcome. The investigative report did not read like a story, and yet it closed the narrative with decisive finality, its findings outlining a pattern of procedural overreach, selective enforcement, and failure of internal oversight that exceeded the boundaries of individual grievance and entered the domain of institutional breach. The HOA president's leadership was formally cited as the central axis around which these patterns had developed, not through a single dramatic decision, but through the accumulation of unchecked discretion compounded over years of unreviewed authority. The recommendation that followed was as restrained as it was irreversible, calling for immediate leadership restructuring, mandatory third-party oversight of enforcement practices, retroactive review of disputed fines, and restitution where selective escalation had caused demonstrable harm. By midday, the board convened under conditions that bore little resemblance to the meetings that had once defined neighborhood governance. The atmosphere now governed not by command, but by consequence. The president who had once shaped every agenda found herself at the center of one she could no longer steer, her authority reduced not by opposition but by process, and as the votes were cast in measured silence, the outcome unfolded not as humiliation but as removal, an administrative conclusion. Drawn by mechanism rather than spectacle, there was no dramatic reaction, no attempt at last-minute persuasion, only the quiet recalibration of a hierarchy that had finally encountered its limit. By evening, the announcement circulated through official channels with careful neutrality, informing residents of interim leadership appointments, compliance reforms, and forthcoming opportunities for community participation in governance restructuring. The neighborhood absorbed the news in waves, not with celebration but with a strange coherence of relief and gravity, as if something long unstable had finally found a fixed position, even if that position was loss. Residents stood in their driveways longer than usual that night, conversations unfolding slowly, the weight of what had ended settling beside the anticipation of what would follow. Some spoke with the cautious optimism of people stepping out of shadow, others with the exhaustion of those who had lived too long beneath tension they had never chosen, but had grown accustomed to carrying. Former president retreated from the public eye with the same efficiency that had once characterized her command, her absence immediately altering the social geometry of the block, not through sudden warmth, but through the release of pressure that had shaped movement and silence for years. The HOA office reopened days later under interim administration with doors figuratively and literally more open than before. Communication slow but steady, enforcement restrained, the entire rhythm of governance reset not through rebellion but through recalibration. The audit's ripple effects continued outward as restitution procedures were initiated, fines revisited, warnings reclassified, and past enforcement decisions brought into patient review. Each file reopened serving as a quiet acknowledgement that order obtained without balance is not order at all, but deferred reckoning. The workshop's integration into municipal programs moved forward in parallel, now fully untethered from the threat that had once aimed so confidently at its foundation. Public training sessions were announced, community restoration grants formalized, and partnerships with educational institutions confirmed, the space no longer operating merely as a private enterprise, but as a recognized node within the city's preservation network. What had once been framed as disruption now wore the unmistakable contours of contribution, its legitimacy no longer vulnerable to narrative distortion because it had been embedded into public record and civic infrastructure. The mayor's quiet endorsement unfolded not through speech but through sustained alignment, the economic and cultural visibility of the workshop expanding through channels that would outlast electoral cycles and individual conflicts alike. Neighbors who once avoided the fence now crossed it with tentative curiosity, attending open sessions, observing demonstrations, rediscovering the ordinary wonder of craftsmanship unburdened by suspicion. A few returned with hesitant apologies spoken not through formality but through changed behavior, small gestures that did not seek absolution but acknowledged transformation. The community's psychological center shifted from compliance to participation, from reactive obedience to deliberate engagement, and this transformation embedded itself not in bylaws alone, but in the way residents spoke to one another, questioned authority, and measured certainty against verification rather than charisma. The quiet danger of unquestioned governance had been named not through outrage but through exposure, and in that naming, the neighborhood acquired a new vocabulary for power, one that resisted consolidation by default. Former president's influence lingered only as memory and caution, her absence casting a longer educational shadow than any presence ever had. an unspoken reminder of how easily order can become dominance when insulated from accountability. The board, reshaped and reoriented under oversight, moved with an almost visible humility, every decision traceable, every enforcement action annotated, authority now practiced with a restraint that reflected its newly defined limits. The investigation's final administrative steps concluded months later with no further disciplinary expansion, not because wrongdoing had vanished, but because what remained had been absorbed into systems now designed to detect rather than enable imbalance. The neighborhood did not transform into harmony overnight, but it transformed into something rarer and more durable, a community no longer organized solely around fear of consequence, but around shared responsibility for how consequence should be defined. The workshop stood at the quiet center of this new equilibrium, no longer emblem or battleground, but simply a place of work. Restoration continuing as it always had, patient hands repairing what time had worn down. The accusation that had once threatened to collapse it now existed only as a cautionary footnote in a much larger story of structural correction. What began as an attempt to wield authority through allegation had rewritten the architecture of authority itself, redistributing power not through conquest but through scrutiny, not through revenge but through record. The street that once held its breath at the approach of enforcement now learned a different posture, one of observation without fear, participation without compulsion. And in that quiet recalibration, the true resolution revealed itself not in victory or defeat, but in the irreversible redefinition of what control would mean from that day forward.